But again, welcome everybody to the African Doctoral Academy Masterclass. My name is Natalie Kovalik, and I'm the Program Manager at the African Doctoral Academy here at Stellenbosch University. And I'm joined by our guest speaker, Professor Wayne Babchuk. Professor Babchuk is a Professor of Practice in the Qualitative, Quantitative, and Psychometrics program at the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He holds a BS in Education, a MA in Anthropology, a MA in Adult and Continuing Education, and a PhD in Community and Human Resources. Prof. Babchuk is an applied research methodologist who teaches and conducts research on history, epistemology, application, and instruction of qualitative research across disciplines. He is also involved in several other research tracks. Professor Babchuk serves on numerous graduate supervisory committees, specializing in training students in the design and application of qualitative and mixed methods research. He serves as a treasurer and executive board member of the Kalahari People's Fund of Southern Africa and is editor-in-chief for the Journal of Ethnographic and Qualitative Research. Prof. Babchuk will be presenting the course and the masterclass today. The topic is Principles and Practices of Qualitative Research with a particular focus on ethnographic research. I can mention from our side, we are very honored to have Professor Babchuk. He has been presenting a course for Introduction to Qualitative Research Design and Methodology at the African Doctoral Academy since 2017. So one of our very strong presenters and partners. And we are really looking forward to the speech. We'll be opening the floor to questions after the presentation. So please feel free to ask your questions either in the chat or the Q&A. And my colleague Luther will be also assisting with the questions after the presentation. I'd just like to also remind everybody that is joining, the session is being recorded and it will be made available on YouTube. All of the links will be on our website where you'll be able to find more information. So after saying all of that, again, welcome and thank you. I'm going to hand over the platform to Professor Babchuk. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm really happy to see it's such a big turnout. I'll start, since qualitative research is a storytelling tradition, I'll start with a short story. I was giving a presentation here in the United States, a couple presentations at a conference on qualitative research, and I gave the first one at 9 in the morning, and then at lunchtime, I was sitting there in the auditorium meeting, and it started filling up, and there was hundreds of people. And I said to the person, "Why are there so many people here?" And they said, "Well, they're coming for the keynote." And I said, "Well, who's the keynote?" And they go, "Well, you're the keynote." And they forgot to tell me that. So a few minutes later, I was presenting to 300 people, and hopefully we'll have that kind of turnout here. So I'd like to start after that little story here by saying a couple things. One is that we're going to be presenting, talking about ethnographic and qualitative research, but a very important note I'd like to make to get started. We're going to be presenting ethnography as a qualitative methodology, but technically ethnography is not solely qualitative. In fact, in the long history of ethnographic research, it's often been multi-method, where people have used quantitative, qualitative, and multi-method, and more recently mixed methods research to study a culture sharing group. And so ethnography is a study of a culture sharing group, and it doesn't imply a specific methodology, which sometimes people think it does. And so I'm a member of 3 departments in Ed Psych, Anthropology, and Sociology. And when I teach the class in anthropology, if I taught it as a qualitative methodology, they'd cut my tongue out and bury it. But in education, it's often viewed as more of a qualitative approach, and we'll take that perspective here. But again, I just think it's very important to note that it's not synonymous, ethnography, with qualitative research. There's also we'll cover a number of topics, and I'm kind of the master, or I guess doctor of overkill. So there's a lot of slides here, and some of them are for your information since you have access, I guess, to the slideshow. And there's a lot of resources on here, and we're not going to spend, a lot of time on a lot of slides. We'll slide by. So we'll talk about definitions, why we use qualitative research, the historical background of qualitative research, epistemological underpinnings of qualitative research, ethics, and then the more kind of divided in two sections, just like the courses I've taught, a number of different courses actually for the African Doctoral Academy, not just, the introduction. And in my home institution, I've taught maybe 9 different courses. And I typically divide those courses into the first half being history of qualitative, ethics, epistemology, and contemporary approaches. And then the second half is more practical applications of qualitative research, and that's what we'll do here. So we'll transition to purpose statements and research questions, sampling, fundamental principles of data collection and analysis, issues of validity and reliability, and some contemporary approaches, and then and publication. And again, although this will be a holistic presentation on qualitative research, we'll flag ethnographic research, as part of it. I've been an ethnographer for my entire career and have a strong background in anthropology, and have done field work there in Namibia with the Kung peoples, or Kalahari San peoples, that many of you are probably familiar with, one of the more studied groups in the history of anthropology. I remember, as Natalie mentioned in the introduction, of the Kalahari Peoples Fund, which you can Google, which is a nonprofit organization to help indigenous peoples of sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly recent hunter-gatherers. And so there's been a lot of work done around there, and we try to have a community-centered approach where the people themselves to decide how the funding that we get from all over the world, how that funding is spent. Okay, so this is a slide. We're not going to go over the 25 things here, but hopefully you'd find it useful if this is your dissertation or a qualitative study. There's a checklist here in front of you that outlines all the different aspects or sections that you would need to address. And we've historically taught at the University of Nebraska. Nebraska, for those you don't know, is in the dead center of the United States. We're part of a Big Ten conference and have a strong history in qualitative and mixed methods research. And John Cresswell, who's one of the icons of qualitative research, is who gave me a lot of my training here at the university. And so we've kind of been at the epicenter in the United States and even worldwide in qualitative and mixed methods research. And we typically teach a very systematic, what I call a checklist approach, like we see here, a very detailed and rigorous approach to qualitative research. And our thinking is that we want people to have a firm understanding of the systematic structure of qualitative research. And as you become more of an expert in qualitative research, you can decide what you want to do and what you don't want to do. But we want everyone to have a scaffolding to work from. And I use the analogy of if you're an artist, you might start painting still lifes before you went into abstract art, for example. Or if you're a musician, you'd start playing scales until you had the scales, down and some real fundamentals before you started improvising or going out on your own. And that's kind of how, though, we've typically viewed these courses. So qualitative research is just a broad general term that emphasizes a series of characteristics that we'll talk about in this workshop of inductive reasoning, collecting data, often in natural settings where the behavior takes place, particularly in ethnography, and understanding participant points of view. Historically, qualitative research has historically been driven by interviews as a data collection method and participant observation, which I think it's also important to note with participant observation that that's not solely a qualitative approach. There's many forms of quantitative participant observation where you have checklists of frequencies and durations of behaviors and things like that. But in our setting here, participant observation and qualitative research is a little different than that. and we'll talk about that a little later. Document analysis, and then there's a whole wide range of other forms of data collection, and some in contemporary qualitative research, these old school approaches are still popular, but a number of people have decided that it'd be more productive and fruitful for them to use, I guess, more imaginative and creative ways of collecting data, such as a popular approach is called photo voice, if some of you heard of that, and you'd ask participants to take pictures of things that they think are important or to the topic, or you provide pictures and have participants, discuss those pictures, or you have people, draw or journal or do other things to better inform your research question. For instance, I was part of a study where a student was asking first grade students to draw what a scientist looked like, to see if what was in their minds. Were the people, were they white, were they black, were they male, were they female, young, old, things like that. And that was an interesting study. And I'd also like to note that if you want to contact me after this workshop, I'd be happy to answer your emails. Um, and uh, and I want to let you know that I'll continue to be accessible, after this workshop. And I work a lot of hours here, and I know it's a novel idea with many, but I do, in fact, answer student emails. So here's some texts that are popular in qualitative research. You can see on the left of the screen, Qualitative Research by Merriam and Tisdale, and I typically use that's a good introductory reader. And then I also use in both intro and advanced courses, I mentioned John Cresswell, again, a giant in the field of qualitative and mixed methods research. If you go to Google Scholar, he's been cited millions of times, and this is an extremely influential text, this 5 approaches, and I just got a copy of this 5th edition 2 days ago, so it's brand new. And then he's also got with his daughter Joanna 30 essential skills for the qualitative researcher. That wouldn't be a very expensive text if you wanted some guidance in the basics of qualitative research. A couple others: Constructing Grounded Theory, Kathy Charmez, the late Kathy Charmez, passed a couple of years ago, but has been a giant in the field of qualitative research. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on grounded theory. At the time, I was just interested in grounded theory in 1997 and didn't realize what a life-changing event that would be, as that swung me into the world of research methodology, to ultimately moving my 3 department positions from anthropology and sociology all into educational psychology and the quantitative, qualitative, and psychometric methods program. Here's also another text, Educational Research. That's the older edition. One is just coming out right now as well, that is co-authored by John Cresswell, and then Tim Gutterman, who's been even longer participant in the African Doctoral Academy at Stellenbosch, and a colleague that I work extensively with. Another good text here is Qualitative Research Methods by Sarah Tracy. She's also at times taught for the African Doctoral Academy. Here's a handbook, which is very expensive, but kind of the Bible of qualitative research, that was published in 2018, the 5th edition, and I'm sure there'll be another one of those and several other texts. And then here's a few specifically on ethnography. The Spradley ethnographic interview, very structured approach. He has a follow-up. This is 1979, called Participant Observation. And then ethnography by Harry Wolcott, and then here's one by David Fetterman. And these are 3 of the texts I use when I teach ethnography, as opposed to qualitative research when I teach ethnographic methods. So there's a number of key characteristics of qualitative research. And this first one is really the big one, a focus on understanding participants' point of view and how they construct meaning. Again, in qualitative research, the focus is historically different than quantitative research, and that takes some getting used to by quantitatively trained scholars, that you're not looking to generalize your information to a larger sample, but you're looking for information-rich cases to answer your research questions. So the researchers are the experts. We shift the mantle of authority from researchers to participants. In quantitative research, we study the literature, we become experts, and then we test our ideas against the data. In qualitative research, we kind of take a different approach where the participants are given more status relative to the researcher, and those participants are who educate you. The reason why you've invited them to be part of your study is because they're experts, in the central phenomenon that you're studying. And so typically you have some of an emphasis on an emergent design. And what that means is that you can change your study as you go, as information comes to light from your participants, which is also something that's kind of uncomfortable to quantitative researchers. It's like it's cheating, but actually that's one of the strengths of qualitative research, is this ability to adjust, on the fly. So again, you have non-random purposeful sample selection or purposive sampling, where you select individuals that are experts in the phenomenon that you're studying, and that can be your cousin. Students are always asking, well, can I ask my roommate, and I'm like, you can't use your roommate, can you? And I'm always like, you can use anyone you want, as long as they're experienced or experts in the central phenomenon that you're studying. And so you collect the data and you present a narrative style of reporting. So it's much more personal than quantitative research. And this researcher positioning idea is that you let you let the reader know where you're coming from as a researcher, why you're investigating a particular topic, what you know about it, maybe what you expect to find. And it provides more, to use the term, transparency to your study, so people can better understand what it is that where you're coming from and what you're trying to accomplish. And so historically, qualitative research, in quantitative researchers' minds, they often view qualitative research as a means of generating ideas or hypotheses to test. And certainly in an exploratory sequential mixed method study, that would be something that you could do. But qualitative research is much more than generating hypotheses. It's a form of empirical data collection and analysis. And in that sense, it's scientific, in that you're trying to, study a phenomenon and contribute to the larger literature based on a topic. And again, you're not generalizing to in a larger population per se, but you're actually generalizing to a larger database to better understand the studied phenomenon. And so qualitative researchers historically try to minimize power imbalances between researchers and participants and amplify the voices of traditionally oppressed individuals. I don't like the term give voice. You'll see that in the qualitative literature if you read it. People are always talking about giving voice to the participants and traditionally oppressed individuals. I prefer not to use the term give voice, because that to me implies they didn't have a voice until Babchuk showed up, and that's certainly not what we're trying to accomplish here. Okay, so in the history of qualitative research, it has a long history in the fields that I've been working in. In anthropology, we have Bronislaw Malinowski, who is a Polish anthropologist, but he was part of the British school of ethnographic research, and he's kind of considered the father of qualitative research and of research in the field, because he spent spent a couple of years with the Trobriand Islanders, and he didn't really mean to do that, but World War I broke out as he was dropped off to study the Trobrianders, and he was kind of stuck there for a couple of year period, and it changed the course of field work in that you would stay, if you were to do ethnographic work in a faraway range of seasons, and you'd work on learning the language and the like. Also important to note in ethnography that we study a culture sharing group, and most people aren't going to study an exotic to them people from a faraway land, but people within their own culture. And as long as you can define it as a culture sharing group, for instance, in Nebraska here in our city, we have a uh, community organization that serves MENA, Middle Eastern, and North African immigrants and refugees. And I had a doctoral student that was wanting to do an ethnographic study of MENA refugees. And I was like, well, no, that's not, the 22 countries that represent Middle Eastern, North African, and many Arabic populations are certainly not a culture sharing group. But the community center where these individuals are served could then be viewed as a culture sharing group, the people that are using that particular center. So hopefully that makes sense. And then Margaret Mead made a lot of contributions worldwide as an early feminist scholar, and her studies with Samoan adolescents have been controversial over time, but that was her doctoral research, almost 100-year anniversary in 1920, in 1926, where she studied, and she brought the idea to the United States, that other cultures were different, but different doesn't mean imply bad, worse, rank order cultures, but to try to understand in a cultural relative sense other cultures and why people make the decisions that they make. There's a picture of Malinowski with the Trobriand Islanders. Again, a real icon in this tradition. And then there's the original edition of The Coming of Age of Samoa of Margaret Mead. And we could have a lot to say about that, but we'll continue onwards here. So in the United States, the University of Chicago is one of the most prestigious sociology departments in the world, and they wanted to start doing ethnographic field work as well, and they didn't know how to do it, so they went to the anthropologists and said, how do we do ethnographic field work within our own culture? And they started studying all these groups. Some of these are listed that are dated terms from the time, like I'm not even sure what a taxi dance hall is, but essentially they started teaching studying subgroups in Chicago, and then moving elsewhere throughout the United States to study cultural sharing groups and taking a holistic, approach. Now, politically, I think it's important to say that qualitative researchers consider themselves the flag bearers of democracy and justice, because and really emphasize the democratic approach to research, and they kind of set themselves up as the good guys, and the quantitative are the bad guys that are oppressing, traditionally oppressed groups and the like. That's a inaccurate and representation. Again, research methods are tools to study particular problems, and there's many, many quantitative researchers that are solely quantitative researchers that are most interested in social change and social justice issues, just as qualitative researchers are. So it's kind of a false dichotomy if you try to split these in terms of here's who's helping people and here's who's oppressing people. Certainly not an accurate depiction. So in the history of qualitative research, and also heavily influenced by ethnography, are Glaser and Strauss's discovery of grounded theory, which has become an iconic classic. Those two individuals were hired to set up a doctoral program in nursing, the first one in the United States, and they started studying dying patients and the reactions of those around them. And that really set the stage for their new approach to qualitative research, which was obviously grounded theory, and grounded theory being a methodology where you try to develop a theory of a particular process, like dyeing, for example, in this instance, and focus on that. This Guba is considered a real classic, but I'd rather draw your attention to this natural inquiry text by Lincoln and Guba. That is an also iconic text in this tradition. They introduced the term trustworthiness, which was the qualitative parallel to validity, reliability, objectivity, and generalizability of quantitative research. Early qualitative researchers were insecure about the approach and were trying to assess their approaches with traditional quantitative criteria, and that failed miserably because qualitative research is much different than quantitative research. And so they developed independent guidelines to assess the integrity or the validity of qualitative research under the overarching term trustworthiness. So here's some historical text. Again, you have Spradley here, Clifford Geertz talking about thick and rich descriptions. There's naturalistic inquiry. There's discovery of grounded theory. Here's symbolic interactionism. So that with phenomenology are two of the philosophical pillars of qualitative research historically, focusing on how people make meaning, how people interact, how they present themselves, the important role of language, and communication being so paramount among humans as one of the key separators of us from the other great apes. So we then see a proliferation of qualitative research in the 70s and 80s, moving out of anthropology and sociology into a wide range of different disciplines. And now in the classes I teach, I have many STEM students in those classes. And it's qualitative research is growing exponentially in terms of its popularity, as is mixed methods research involving the systematic integration of qualitative and quantitative approaches to more holistically answer a research question. When I teach in anthropology and sociology, students in those disciplines expect a heavy dose of theory and epistemology, where in education, people are more pragmatically focused, and they're more resistant to talking about epistemology. They're kind of like, just give me the 10 steps that I need to do a study. And the world doesn't really work well that way, because we need to really understand the philosophy driving qualitative research. All of us in this workshop have our own worldviews, our own educational goals, our own career goals, and those are, part of your worldview. Like historically, two of my mentors in anthropology had vastly different epistemological perspectives. Both are world known. One individual was a human behavioral ecologist, and he thought he was a quantitative scholar, and he felt his research contributed to the larger knowledge of human behavior to better understand how we behave as a species. And he didn't feel like it was his job to influence policy directly. Where another mentor, who's a qualitative researcher, he took the completely opposite worldview and believes that all research and education should strive to accomplish a central goal of helping eliminate systemic inequalities in society, and to give everyone a better chance to fully realize their both professional and personal goals, their full human potential. And so the central goal of research, in his opinion, is to disrupt the status quo that has, historically marginalized some groups and favored others, as we're all aware. So ontology means the nature of reality. Is there an objective reality, or is reality subjective? And and certainly there might be an objective reality out there, but people question, qualitative researchers, can we access this objective reality, since we all have our own lens, our own social cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and we see things through a clouded lens. And so qualitative researchers are more interested in how people view the world rather than trying to capture some objective world. And I guess an oversimplified metaphor I'll use here is, if you think your foot hurts, your foot hurts. It doesn't really matter if there's a scientific explanation for that or not. Epistemology is, our overarching term here for how we view the world, the various paradigms or worldviews. Why do we study what we do? How do we justify what we study? What's the relationship between the participants and the researchers? Axiology is the values you bring to research, and methodology is the actual process of research itself. So these are, there's no real agreement on different epistemological perspectives. Here's some broad ones that most people would relate to. And we'll just go over these, briefly. Positivism believes there's an objective world, and historically quantitative research is focused on positivist approaches that have a long history in the social sciences, and medical fields, education. But most people aren't positivists, even in quantitative research. They're more post-positivist. And the difference there is post-positivism implies that you can never fully capture objectively an objective world, but you can approximate this objective world through systematic and rigorous methods. And so that's very common in the health sciences and quantitative research, and in some forms of qualitative research. A very popular in qualitative research is an interpretive or constructivism approach that that's based on the idea there's multiple subjective realities that are culturally and socially historically constructed, and that you have to understand how people make meaning and interact with others and view their worlds to truly understand human behavior. So if you're a post-positivist, you could make predictions about human behavior based on species-specific aspects that separate us from the great apes, and cross-cultural universals, and other kinds of causal relationships between variables. And a constructive scientist would say, well, you can also make predictions about people, but those predictions are more based on shared cultural values than on, species-specific aspects of the human condition. Critical theory takes elements of both post-positivism and constructivism. It's very popular right now, and it's an approach to try to shift the power, again, of authority to the participants to accomplish some form of social change, again, most commonly to disrupt the status quo and provide more power to historically marginalized groups. And postmodernism, a more of a philosophical approach that really questions the notions of rationalist notions of science and technological progress. Postmodernists aren't going to disagree that you need to get an anesthetic before you have a root canal, but they're more questioning, how does technological progress in science, how does that really relate to, larger goals of the human condition, and how we view, are we advancing as a civilization? How do we treat immigrants? How do we treat refugees? How do we treat the poor? How do we treat people that are different than us? Are we less violent? How, literally, how are we, viewing our fellow humans? So ethics has become increasingly important. In the US, we have these city trainings that everyone has to go through, and you have to have institutional review board approval. Internationally, most cultures have review boards that review your research, and are based on some real key aspects of the research enterprise. In the US, we have informed consent forms that participants have to sign that specify that the research will be anonymous and that their participation is voluntary in the project and can be terminated any time. What your study is going to be about, what's the risks, in terms of cost benefit risks versus benefits of the research, and be clear about that. And so some major principles of ethical behavior: do no harm, privacy and anonymity, confidentiality, informed consent, rapport and friendship. You try to build rapport with participants, but you don't typically want to cross those lines into friendship. And there's been a whole host of ethical violations that you might be aware of, some of those that are pretty well known worldwide, where researchers have overstepped their relationships with participants. Again, try not to be too intrusive, inappropriate behavior, personal or sexual nature, data interpretation. Are you accurately representing the participant's point of view, or are you just making stuff up as you go along? And so you owe it to the participants and to the ethics of your research to accurately represent what you're learning from your participants. And then the publication of those documents, also involves ethical considerations. Okay, so in the conduct of ethnography or qualitative research, and really in all research, you often identify a gap in the literature, and then you have a research issue, a research problem that you want to study, and then you present that research problem, and from this review of the literature, you provide a purpose statement that guides the purpose of your research. So here's a new edition, but in many editions of the Cresswell text, one of the reasons why the Cresswell 5 Approaches text is so popular worldwide, and thousands of copies have been sold worldwide, it's been translated into 25 languages, is one of the reasons is that what students want to know is, how do we do this research? And so, and from a publication standpoint, publishing companies are interested. They're not altruistic organizations, they're for-profit organizations, and they want textbooks that will be profitable and sell. And the ones that are profitable and sell are the ones that tell or lead or instruct students how to do qualitative research. So this is a script you can use. The purpose of this, particular study, narrative, ethnography, grounded theory, is to understand, or I like the term explore, that's not listed, and then whatever your central phenomenon, and then you'll typically define what that phenomenon is. And so that's historically been considered the most important part of your study. And from that purpose statement, you would rephrase that purpose statement to where you would have a grand tour or central question, where you'd restate that purpose statement in question form, and then you break that into sub-questions. And so here's just an example from grounded theory of a central question, which again, you'd be rewording your purpose statement that you just provided. So you'd have your introduction to the problem, your problem statement, then your punchline would be, the purpose of this research is to explore this or that. And then you would then reword that into a central question, and you break that central question down into component parts. So sampling in qualitative research, we use purposeful sampling. And remember, you're sampling sites as well as participants. People think, you just think of participants, but you have to, gain access to sites and participants, and you look for information-rich individuals, as I mentioned, and the sample sizes are typically much smaller in qualitative research. They can range, they can range to a large number of individuals, but typically they're smaller samples, like between 5 and 25, 30 people. One thing I didn't mention in my introduction is I've served on over 150 doctoral dissertation committees in the last 10 years alone. I'm on about 48 right now. And so I've spent most of my life, I guess much of my professional life, mentoring students to try to work on their dissertations. And for doctoral students here, again, a focus should be on, students are too ambitious and they try to accomplish too much. That's a common problem. What can you focus on in real detail and, do a viable, high quality study, and you're not going to answer all the questions of the world in your dissertation. So qualitative data collection, interviews and questionnaires, observations, documents, audiovisual materials, I've already mentioned those. And here's just, a slide on, some different on these different kinds of data collection. I mentioned some of the more creative types, photographs, pictures, videotapes, things like that. And then documents, interviews, probably being the most common form of data collection. And then observations, also common. A number of different kinds of interviews, one-on-one interviews being probably the most frequently utilized. Focus group interviews, are good for getting a range of people's opinions in one setting, but there's some challenges to focus groups, and you don't want to conduct focus groups of particularly sensitive topics that people won't feel comfortable sharing information. So that, again, that's up to each individual. And so observation, you need to gain access to the site. If you're interviewing someone, you typically are using some form recording device, and you can, obviously, well, people can even use their phones, and you can then have your interviews transcribed either yourself or through various programs. There's one called TEMI, TEMI.com, that charges, I don't think it's real expensive to do transcripts for you, or if it's conducted on Zoom, you add transcripts, and then you need to obviously check those transcripts. As an observer, you typically, in qualitative research, you would have, maybe you'd set up two columns of observation. In the left column, you would have exactly what was happening, a descriptive process. In the right column, you would essentially put your notes of some things that are important, that you're observing, that are kind of notes to yourself. Okay, importantly in this presentation, hopefully this is useful. In all qualitative research studies I do, I use this three-column approach. And so we have the purpose statement, and from that purpose statement, a central question that's broken down into sub-questions. And then I line up the interview questions to explicitly answer those sub-questions in order. And so the purpose of this qualitative research study is to determine how public health workers can better utilize research to improve practice in the area of minority health care. And then it goes on to say our goal is to facilitate more equitable and accessible treatment of members of traditionally underserved groups. So you can tell without even making it explicit that this is critical theory, because we're trying to evoke, social change to provide more access here in this country, in the United States, to better health care for all people in society. And we're working collaboratively with the participants to help facilitate that change. So then you reword it, how can public health workers better utilize research to improve practice in the area of minority health care? And I'm not going to read all the sub-questions. And then to the right, you would ask, typically 10 or 12 questions. You'd have a demographic profile or section at the beginning where you'd ask, you'd have a pseudonym assigned to an individual, their maybe their age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, maybe years that they'd worked in minority healthcare in this, example. And then you'd start your interview, a semi-structured interview protocol, and you'd ask like 10 or 12 questions. you don't want to ask 30 or 40 questions. I mean, that becomes much more of a survey. You're trying to get people to talk in depth about a particular topic. This was done 10 years ago, and there's mistakes here. For example, what percentage proportion of time do you spend working in the area of minority healthcare in a given day? That should be in the demographic section, not in the semi-structured interview protocol. And then this, are there any other suggestions you have of how public health workers can better utilize research for practice? You never want to ask yes, no questions in qualitative research. If you ask someone that, they'll just say, no, I want to go home and eat spaghetti. You know, you need to word it so that you would say something to the effect of, you know, what else can you tell me to better inform me about these topics that we've discussed today, and what other topics did I not cover that you think are important, or and to try to continue the interview. And I typically recommend with a recording device, after the interview is finished and you're by yourself and you're in your car on your way home or in your office or wherever, that you turn the recorder back on, and then you would have your memos or reflective notes of your interview recorded right together with your interview to access that at a later time for data analysis. Okay, so when you analyze data, one thing about qualitative research is you go from, it's iterative, that you go back and forth. So you're collecting data and then you're analyzing data. This is extremely important in qualitative research because if, let's say in the minority healthcare, this was a study of how research is used to improve practice in the area of minority healthcare. So let's say we find a gatekeeper, which we did, and interview 15 people. Well, let's say you interview these 15 people and they come up with something completely different than you thought of, and you wished you would have asked it. And so you can avoid that problem if you, with data collection and analysis being iterative, that if things start emerging in your data analysis that you hadn't thought of, you know, or that you want to adjust, it's not cheating in qualitative research to, you know, to fine tune your study to maybe get it something the participants are telling you are more important that you hadn't thought of or you hadn't put enough emphasis on. So here's steps of qualitative data analysis in popular textbooks. I'm not going to read through all these, but we have these different approaches. And I was invited by Cresswell and Tim Gutterman and the late Michael Federers, who was editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, to work on a paper for qualitative data analysis. And I'll just go through briefly these steps of qualitative data analysis. I have 10 here. You would transcribe interviews, you know, and other forms of data. And in interviews, you'd print transcripts. So you'd have margins on the left and right side of the text. On the left side, you would write your descriptors of what's happening. On the right side, you write memos, you know, like, this is really interesting, or I wonder why more participants haven't talked about this, or this looks like a very important category or theme that's going to emerge. And so those are notes to self in that data analysis section. So you would read through your transcripts a number of times, and you begin, after you'd read through your transcripts, by doing initial or open coding, where you would put descriptors in the left margins and your memos and reflective notes in the right margins. And then once you had, maybe you might have 150 codes, you start eliminating some codes that aren't pertinent to your research questions, and you start looking for similarities and grouping codes into like characteristics, similar characteristics, and those would be categories. You might, from 200 codes, have 15 categories, and then you could see what themes cut across those categories, and, you know, and have several themes. But this data analysis is done differently by different individuals. And so some people stop at the categories, some develop themes. I like this 3-part process of codes to categories to themes. Some people just go codes to themes. Some people just go codes to categories, you know, and if you're doing a grounded theory, you would ultimately generate a theoretical explanation. In qualitative research, you have standards of validation or trustworthiness, where you would use member checking, meaning that you would send your findings back to your participants to make sure you got the story right. Right, meaning that you're accurately representing what they're telling you. You might involve, like, your dissertation committee, you have peer review. If you're a scholar, a professor, you would use your peers to provide feedback often, on your work. And then you could, in this case, we developed tables of quotes of themes by participants. We developed themes, and then we had really two major documents. One where we had the quotes of the participants' perspectives that reinforced or helped generate those themes. And then we went into the literature and developed passages or quotes from the literature that supported those themes. And when you write up your analysis, you're writing your findings in your findings section, and you don't reference the literature in your findings. You just talk about your findings and your themes or categories or theory. And then in the next discussion section, you would revisit those themes and tie those into the larger literature base, often using, visual displays to do that. Okay, there's a number of contemporary qualitative approaches. Cresswell, like the Big Five animals in Africa, has the big five approaches of narrative, ethnography, grounded theory, phenomenology, and case study. Some people have historically done basic or descriptive qualitative research that doesn't follow the systematic guidelines of these five approaches. Action research, participatory action research, community-based participatory action research are all more focused on participant involvement to various degrees in the research and are particularly popular. So grounded theory's goal is to generate a theoretical explanation, model, or typology grounded in the data. And so you would find what was most important to your participants and kind of winnow that down to, a core process that you're looking at or a core category. And then you'd essentially collect data to fully develop your emerging theory. Case study is a bounded system or case where you would have to have a clearly bounded system, and you'd collect multiple forms of data to understand that particular bounded system, and it has to be a reasonable bounded system. I mean, like, all middle school teachers in South Africa is technically a bounded system, but that's too big. You'd want to look at perhaps two middle schools in Johannesburg or something like that was a more manageable and realistic case. Phenomenology, you look at the shared lived experiences of a central phenomenon. And ethnography, again, you study a culture sharing group. In both case study and ethnography, you really need to collect multiple forms of data. Narrative can be viewed different ways in this Cresswellian approach we're talking about here is an in-depth story around a particular topic of one and two individuals. And again, action research involves working collaboratively with participants. And so there's a lot of design features of these different approaches of data analysis, advantages and challenges. Obviously, we don't have time to provide a workshop on all five of these approaches. And ethnography, historically useful for developing intimate understanding of a culture sharing group. We've got, problems here. Gomez, the miracle cat, has showed up to be part of this presentation. Okay, so a ethnography study of a culture sharing group historically involves Western researchers studying indigenous groups. In the U.S., there was much focus on Native American tribes, and there's been historically a real love-hate relationship between ethnographers and Native Indian groups because those individuals, anthropologists that have studied them, have been very sympathetic, and real in favor of human rights of the groups they study, but they also represent the colonial, powers that have oppressed their peoples. And that would be the case with, American researchers all over the world. There's been a lot of Japanese researchers, and other individuals. So ethnography is kind of tricky. Like, for me, when I'm studying, when I've gone and done field work in Africa, you have to ask some, really important questions like, why is some, white guy from Lincoln, Nebraska butting into people's lives, in Africa? And, these are reasonable questions to ask and something that everyone needs to come to grips with if they're studying another culture. Like, what impact are you having on the people you study? How reciprocal is that relationship? What can participants benefit from? And I guess my wife is also an ethnographer, and the way we've reconciled that is, the people that we study need help. It's been a difficult transition from traditional lifestyles to more of a state-based economy. And so, again, in the Kalahari People's Fund, we raise funds and then go to the people themselves to, like, how do we use these funds to better improve your lives? Again, and there's some historical pictures of the Kung or Kung San or Kalahari San Zuntua peoples in all these nations here, but particularly studied in Namibia and Botswana, in this area where I have the Kalahari People's Fund link there, and some early ethnographers, which again, these individuals, as I think many of you know, living not that long ago, like in my lifetime, 50 years ago, often still living these traditional lifestyles. And of course, very difficult to make a transition to state level societies. In ethnographic research, we have emic data, which is information provided by participants in a study, and that is the participant's point of view as opposed to edic data, which is your ethnographer's interpretation of participant perspectives. And all studies involve various combinations of emic and edic data, and I would say in the history of ethnography and qualitative research, things have shifted more and more from edict to emic, where at one time the researchers had pretty big egos and were, kind of in charge of the whole thing, and that's kind of shifted now to putting much more emphasis on the participants' point of views and what they're getting out of the research. And that's contemporary ethnographic research in your own nation or in someone else's nation involves a heavy level of reciprocity between the parties that are affected. So two broad types of ethnography. Realist ethnography is historical, and that's when people ethnographers provided a distant and objective account, and they kind of mistakenly believed that they could be so well trained that they were unbiased. Distance means that they weren't involved emotionally with it. They were just scientists reporting on facts. And, in more recent times, people have rejected that account. Everyone has their own cultural baggage they bring with them. And there's been much more emphasis on critical ethnography. And this it should say, has more of an emic focus, not edic focus. The researcher advocates for social change, social justice, and, and really moves the needle to more participatory approaches. And here's a list of various kinds of ethnography. Case studies often involved with ethnography. An ethnographic case study like Malinowski's Trobriand Islanders would be a bounded system of a culture sharing group. You have feminist ethnographers, critical ethnographers, as mentioned a minute ago. Autoethnography would be a study of yourself and how you fit into, a particular problem. Like, for instance, I spent 7 years as a lecturer or adjunct individual, and I always wanted and never had the time to do an autoethnography of my experiences, coping with, the really temporary employment, aspect where, a lecturer or adjunct, typically doesn't get health benefits or retirement benefits, isn't part of the department's meetings or setting curriculum, often teaches at multiple institutions at the same time. You never have guaranteed, you sign contracts semester by semester. And so you would, if you're doing an audit ethnography, you write about these larger problems and issues, and then you talk about how you fit into those. So here's procedures for conducting out of Cresswell and Gutterman's educational research text. They provide, again, there's a lot of information here. They provide steps in order to be able to conduct realist or critical ethnographies or ethnographic case studies that are useful. This text is very useful, and you can buy it in binder form for not a lot of money. So finally here, as I think I'm getting close to my time here, I'm, as mentioned earlier in the introduction, I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ethnographic and Qualitative Research. Obviously people are interested in publishing. You can publish in a number of formats. In academics, the most prestigious are journals that are peer-reviewed journals. Book chapters not quite as prestigious. Proposals are funding can be important, but kind of the gold standard, I think, as we're all aware, is our peer-reviewed journals. And for those people that are in tenure track positions, expected to publish at a pretty high rate in peer-reviewed journals. So you would typically identify a couple of journals that are most pertinent to your dissertation or to your research. What could you get the most mileage out of? And then you have to ask yourself, how good is my study? Because it's obviously different. Like if you get into the qualitative journal, the research journal field methods, they may, I don't know what their acceptance rate is, but it might be like 5 out of 100 or 2 out of 100 submissions. So you've got to be realistic, like just how good do you think your study is, and then look at, the competitiveness of different journals, and then examine guidelines. And one thing that makes me kind of crazy as an editor-in-chief is I'm the front line. So people submit articles to me and I have to decide if they go out to be peer reviewed or if I give them a desk reject. But the point of this story is all of our steps we'll get to are clearly outlined on our website, and people aren't following the directions that we give them for submission, and it's not done correctly. And when I first started a few years ago, I was a nicer person than I am now because I would really help the authors with this. And now I just got so tired of it that I just basically sent it back and said, please follow our submission instructions and resubmit. And I think it's fair to expect that, people follow your submission, and all journals have submission, instructions one needs to follow. Here's a list just for reference of qualitative journals. Ours is, again, the Journal of Ethnographic and Qualitative Research. We're interested in rigorous qualitative methods. We demand these major headings: methods, results, discussions, limitations, future research. And we provide, explicit directions, of how to, get published in our journal. There's the link to the journal. And, typically you'd go to a journal and see what kind of articles that they'd published. Here's a summary of instructions to authors. I'm kind of out of time here. We could click on these, but I guess we probably don't need to do that. But we have explicit instructions, as I've said several times. What can you do to increase the likelihood of getting published in our journal? And then we screen those journals, those articles, and send those out for peer review.
Thanks very, very much, Professor Babchuk, for a very informative session. It was very rich in content. But also I think it gave people that are starting out their research a nice idea of where they can find resources, and those that are very much involved in their research, how they can develop and go further into their study. So thank you very, very much. We have got several questions. I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Luther, who will be asking these to you. And I do know that we have to be conscious of time. But again, I'd just like to thank you as well as everybody that has participated in this session today. So Luther,
Thank you,
can I hand
Natalie.
over? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. So, Professor, we have a couple of questions that people popped in the chat and Q&A function. So I'm just going to be going through them one by one, and hopefully you'll be able to assist the participants. So we've got one question where one participant asks, what is the right way to reflect the experiences of the people you are studying without using the term giving voice? So that was the first question right there.
Yeah, I guess it's just a semantic issue where I say amplify the voice, that you're helping their voices be heard rather than giving them a voice. Giving them a voice doesn't sound like they had one till you showed up, and they all have voices, and so you're trying to, essentially, word it. No one but me seems to talk about this, but I feel like the language is very important in terms of how things are perceived. And you don't want to be paternalistic or patronizing, again, that you're this great expert and that you're doing a favor to the participants. You want your participants to be as on equal grounds as possible with you, and that you're helping share their voices, with, the readers. Thanks for all
Okay.
the compliments people are putting in. I appreciate it.
Okay, and here's another one. Someone says, please could the presenter briefly discuss autoethnography and its basis as well as its contrast to ethnography?
Okay, so autoethnography again is the study of yourself, but it's not like a biography, an autobiography. You're choosing a topic like the example I gave, like the experiences of a lecturer or adjunct, and you would go to the literature and you would see what people have written, and then you talk about your own experiences, and how those tie into that. So you would essentially be bouncing your back and forth between your experiences and the literature, in your analysis to better shed light on the particular problem that you're studying. And again, the example I used was being an adjunct or lecturer, which is, about, in the United States, about 40 or 50% of all courses in college are taught by temporary instructors. And I'm sure it's pretty common, there as well.
Okay, here's another one. Someone asks if my study focuses on cultural artifacts of a specific cultural group, does that make it an ethnographic case study?
Well, with a case study, it has to be a bounded system. So, I guess that would be, I'd have to know more about it than that. But yeah, I mean, if you're studying a culture sharing group, that would be, ethnography. If it's bounded, typically you'd want it bounded, in some form if you wanted to use the term ethnographic case study rather than like, if, like it'd be hard for, if you're studying, let's say, um, Kenyan immigrants to the United States, that would be kind of difficult as a bounded system, but you could have a culture sharing group, and I'd probably stick with ethnography. Cresswell recommends, when possible, just to focus on one particular approach, because things can get pretty complicated when you start combining them. I've been working on something called ethnographic grounded theory, where you combine grounded theory and ethnography, and that's maybe a story for another day.
Okay, and here's another question. Someone's like, could we briefly touch on institutional ethnography and how it differs from the types of ethnography discussed today?
Institutional meaning a particular organization. I mean, that again, if you did that, it could be a culture sharing group, and you'd use the same procedures that you'd use for ethnography of interviewing and participant observation if documents are relevant. And in fact, anthropologists have expanded, into studying, a number of different institutional organizations to try to provide a different lens than someone might have that's, part of that particular organization.
Okay. Another one. Someone's like, can you kindly explain what you mean by the researcher acts as a primary data collection instrument?
That means, as a researcher, that you're the one collecting the data. You're firsthand, you're, interviewing or observing or collecting documents.
Okay, and here's another one, an interesting one. How do you ensure the validity and reliability of finding in ethnographic research?
Well, there's again, to go back to Lincoln and Guba's trustworthiness, and Cresswell has an article with Dana Miller that's dated 2000. If you Google it's Cresswell and Miller, and they list 10 or so validation strategies, that cut across qualitative research. And those would be, again, things like member checking, taking the data back to the participants to make sure that it's accurate, peer review, multiple forms of data collection will help the integrity of a study. Multiple researchers collaborating will help the integrity of the study. Researcher positioning and reflexivity of how you fit into the study would be another validation technique. What's more confusing is that, and controversial, as Cresswell has always recommended, that you need at least 2 validation strategies out of the 10, but he doesn't specify which 2 are more important. Are 4 twice as good as 2, or do you want to get all 10? And I guess my answer to that is that more is more. And so if you have more ways of validating a study, that's going to help its perception, particularly by quantitative researchers.
Okay, thank you for that.
All good questions.
Okay, here's another one. What are some common challenges and mistakes researchers make when conducting ethnographic research, and how can they be addressed?
Well, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, there's, things that you don't anticipate. And, one needs to, I think, be flexible and know that there's going to be mistakes. And I think, really the key to everything, not just research, is your honesty and transparency. If, people feel that you're sincere, and again, that you're trying to work in a way that benefits them. It's just not a selfish, enterprise. I think that, that would be, is a really good strategy, because again, you're changing the culture that you study, as well as, you're observing it, but you're also impacting that particular culture. And there's been a lot of examples, because, ethnographers have historically wanted to give benefits to the people they study for reciprocity, but you've got to be careful what those benefits are. I mean, if you start passing out packs of Marlboros and Hershey bars, to people that aren't, you can have, or in a much more dramatic incidents, like among the Yanomama, who are, tribal horticulturists in South America, you start passing out machetes to a Stone Age culture, you're going to have a dramatic effect on that. And the problem is that you want to give people what they want the most, for obvious reasons. And then that can be really tricky in terms of changing the culture. Both parties change in ethnographic research, and I don't know really how that can be avoided.
Okay, and one of the participants is asking, do you have any recommended sources on qualitative research written by African scholars?
Um, Yeah, there's some. I'd have to go through my stuff. The history of qualitative research has, historically been, primarily in the United States, but it's a topic that I think about, quite a bit, teaching in the African Doctoral Academy to try to incorporate some more studies. And I think one of our participants is a faculty member at Stellenbosch that I've co-taught courses, Deb Skinstat. That would be she would be a great resource to try to get more detail, there.
Okay, I think with that, it's mostly been positive comments. I'm sure if other people have questions, they'll pop you an email and maybe you can engage further. But yeah,
Yeah, I'm
thank.
happy if
Okay.
anyone else has any questions now. But I'd be again happy to answer emails. I think that one thing that has always kind of befuddled me in the world of academics is that it seems as many professors, probably there as well as here, as particular here, but probably there as well, don't seem to want to interact with students. And I always think, well, why did you go into education if, you didn't want to interact with students? So I try to be very responsive to students and feel like that's a central part of my job and my educational career. I
Okay,
saw
thank.
somebody else had a question on something on positivism or something. Was it?
Okay, let me just, okay. Then someone, oh yeah, I've just found the question. Someone says, Prof, would you be willing to accommodate some elementary positivism within qualitative research? Because my background is positivistic in nature, and I'm now loving qualitative positivism.
Well, we probably use the term post-positivism. Again, very few people are pure positivists. And, one thing qualitative researchers have mistakenly attacked quantitative researchers on is that they don't understand that it's difficult to assess an objective world. Quantitative scholars are intimately familiar with how hard it is to assess an objective world. And that's why there's so many rigorous and systematic procedures long associated with quantitative research methods and inter-rater reliability and validity and face and construct validity and all these things. And so I think all research shares in common that you're trying to empirically understand some form of social behavior, in detail, and you can and I think importantly, what Barney Glaser, the grounded theorist, said was all is data. Any data that you can bring to bear on your research question is fair game. And I've had a lot of people think you only can use qualitative data in a qualitative study. Well, that's not the case. If there's any data that bears on the topic that you can access, it's fair game to better answer your research question.
Okay.
Hope I answered that.
I think
Prof,
you did.
we just want to double check your time. Do you still have time? Because we've actually realized that there's another set of questions in the Q&A as well. So I don't know how your time, could you maybe take another 2 more questions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Luther, I'm going to hand
I
over
guess
to the
it's
last.
supposed to end at 20 after. In my mind, it was supposed to end in 10 minutes, 15 minutes anyway. So, I'm just hanging out answering questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. Let's take some more. Someone says, sorry to divert you a bit. There's a buzz method known as netnography, having merged from ethnography. And they continue to say, my doctoral study is focusing on the evolution, adoption, and e-papers in the press. How can you guide me on the appropriate method?
I don't know a lot about ethnography, but one of my key doctoral advisees, Alexis Chavez, here is really big on ethnography. And if you sent me an email, I could pass it on to him and he could better answer questions, because that is becoming more, various online approaches are becoming more popular in qualitative research.
Okay. We'll be sharing the email later on in the chat function. Then here's another question. What's your take on helicopter research and epistemologically speaking, your take on indigenous research as another paradigm to current favorite paradigms?
I don't really know too much what the helicopter research means, but there's a long debate in ethnography whether you're better as an indigenous scholar to study your own society, that you're closer to it. And some would argue that you're too close to your own society and you don't really see it, for what it is, that sometimes it's advantage, to be an outsider. And I'd say the answer to that is all of the above. I mean, there's certain things to be gained. And so as a researcher, you want to certainly get the insider's perspective, but that part of the plan is you're getting training in research methods. You're trying to develop expertise to be able to do research, and that hopefully your perspective can contribute to the understanding of the phenomenon that to help augment the participants' perspectives.
Okay, Professor, maybe one more question.
Okay.
One participant says, any guidance, Professor, any guidance on the issue of to saturate or not to saturate and the debate surrounding this?
Okay, so in qualitative research, there's really two forms of saturations. There's like what I call, I'm just making this up, this term, like generic saturation, which most qualitative research, you would collect data until you felt that no new information was emerging that pertained to the research question. The other form of saturation is theoretical saturation and grounded theory, which is similar, and it involves the saturation of your developing or emerging theory, rather than just a holistic account. But when do you feel comfortable that you've really, reached saturation in providing information on that particular theory? And so one of the mistakes in the Cresswell text, and I don't know, I just got the new edition, so I don't know if it's still in there, is in his purpose statement scripts, he's putting numbers in there like the purpose of this study is to explore 15 African Americans, women's viewpoints on. You should never write a purpose statement like that, because you don't know how many participants are going to be in your study when you're writing your purpose statement. And so to put any number in your purpose statement is a mistake, because you're typically going to collect data until you reach saturation. And so you don't know how many participants you're going to have. And so for your review board permissions, you've got to shoot high and say that you're going to interview up to 50 participants. And that's a lot easier, when you reach saturation at 17, than if you say you're going to interview 10 and you haven't reached saturation, you have to go back to the review board for more permissions for more participants.
Okay, I know I said that was the last question, but I think this one is a good one to close off the Q&A, right? So someone says, can you please recommend forums or interest groups specifically focused on ethnographic research that we could join?
I guess I don't really, outside of the journals, and, there's, we used to do an international conference on ethnography, but I guess I really don't know of any forums just off the top of my head, where people are, they probably exist, but I tend to prefer not making stuff up when people ask me questions. So that'll be my response over here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. That will be all from the Q&A side. I'm going to be popping his email in the chat and function. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just want to thank all the participants. I'm really pleased that this many people are interested in it, and I did my best. I hope that it was useful, and I want to thank Natalie and you, and the African Doctoral Academy for this workshop. Thank you.
We would also like to extend our thanks again, Professor Babchuk. It's always a pleasure having you, and excellent job. And I think, as all the participants have also said, it was fantastic. Also, thank you to all the participants that joined today, and also the excellent job by my colleague Luther for asking multiple questions. But yes, we look forward to having another webinar again in April. But I can also mention that Professor Babchuk will be also involved in our winter school, which will be coming up in July. So please keep a lookout on our website for that. We're looking forward to having you again, Professor Babchuk. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to have you guys in classes face to face, since I can't see your faces and I don't know who you are. So I'd like to meet you in person. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And then also, just to mention and just to close off the session, we will be sort of distributing a link to the recording. So everybody will have that. And we will also be speaking to Professor Babchuk about his email, and obviously continuing this conversation outside of this room. So thank you again. And we hope everybody has a very good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Babchuk. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.